Welcome everybody to our last event for the academic year at the Fraser Center here at Regis College at the University of Toronto. I hope that you and all your loved ones are safe during these unprecedented times. My name is John Dudosky, and I'm a professor here at Regis and the director of the Monsignor John Mary Fraser Center for Practical Theology. I will begin with the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and Regis College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Recognition. The programming offered by the Monsignor John Mary Fraser Center of Practical Theology and the Scarborough Missions Chair of Interreligious Dialogue was made possible through the Scarborough Missions Legacy. Scarborough Missions is a society of apostolic life of Canadian Catholics, priests, and laity, motivated by the Spirit and dedicated to the person, teaching, and mission of Jesus Christ as expressed in his words, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. The Scarborough Missions Legacy seeks to further its ministry work by providing financial assistance to deserving organizations with like-minded objectives. As a Jesuit institution, the Fraser Center at Regis College also adopts principles of Ignatian spirituality for its wide variety of engagements and programming. I want to introduce our Associate Director, Sister Petite Lau, a doctoral candidate here at Regis College and recent winner of an award for her outstanding comprehensive exams. If she can do it at the exams, she has a bright career ahead of her. So we're excited to have her here, and she's really does a lot of the legwork and promotion for the center. Also, we've had assistance from Regis College. Jessica Deneen has been helping us with the marketing for this event. We have a tech expert, Ashley Tran, who is an MDiv student here at the college. And I want to thank especially Jared Ryan for his initiative and heavy lifting of this event. While we prefer to meet face-to-face rather than through a glass darkly, in the interest of preserving some interaction, we invite your questions to be sent through the comments function on the Zoom webinar. While we may not get to all the questions, we will try to collate and address some of these, as many as we can, after the speakers today. At this point, I'm going to introduce the moderator for today's session. Jaroslav Skira, Professor Jerry Skira, is an associate professor of history and systematic theology at Regis College since 2001. Happy 20th anniversary, Jerry Skira. He has carried out formative research on Eastern Christianity in relation to Vatican II. He is the founding director of the Graduate Center for Theological Studies at TST and finished his term in 2017. He has generously accepted to be the acting director of the Fraser Center for the second part of this year while I'm away on research leave. And with no further ado, I turn it over to Jerry.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Dudosky. I welcome everyone from near and afar. We have over 100 participants within this panel, our webinar for today. So we welcome our TST colleagues and students. We also welcome those who are join us from other institutions, both in North America and abroad. The format of today's discussions that Professor Dudosky has alluded to is we'll invite Professor Keenan to begin with his keynote address to our community. And then we'll follow with the responses by our other panelists. They'll have about 10 minutes to respond to each other. And at the end, we'll have a chance for them to discuss amongst each other. Perhaps Professor Keenan would like to respond to some of their comments or questions. And then we'll open it up to the broader community for questions, which will be posted to the chat room the chat function, and I'll do my best to try to call those or to moderate those as we pose them to our speakers. So what I'll do first is I'll introduce Professor Keenan for his talk, and then when it's time for the respondents to respond, I'll provide a little bit of an introduction to them. Professor James Keenan, SJ, is the Canisius Chair and Director of the Jesuit Institute at Boston College and Vice Provost for Global Engagement. A Jesuit priest since 1982, he received a licentiate and doctorate from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He's edited or written over 25 books and published an amazing over 400 essays, articles, and reviews. As the founder of the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, he chaired the international conference in Padua, Trento, and Sarajevo. In addition to Boston College, he has taught at Fordham University, John Carroll University, the Ateneo de Manila, Dharmaram in Bangalore, and at his alma mater. He recently wrote University Ethics, How Colleges Can Build and Benefit from a Culture of Ethics, and had just finished editing 2 books, Building Bridges in Sarajevo, the Plenary Papers of Sarajevo 2018, and Street Homelessness and Catholic Theological Ethics. He is presently writing another book, A Brief History of Catholic Ethics, and is the editor of Theological Studies, and he's just finished a very long meeting with that community. So we welcome Professor Keenan. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to say just 2 points before I start so that you can follow me. I want you to know what are my hopes that you'll get from this conversation. And the first is that I am struck by the fact that no matter how many courses that you do in teaching people on conscience formation, at the end, there seems to be something else going on in order to elicit from people conscience formation. And what I want to suggest is that we have to ask the question, how in touch are people with their own vulnerability? And secondly, how capable are they in that vulnerability to recognize what needs to be recognized? So I want to anticipate conscience by saying that we have to look at vulnerability and recognition as 2 categories prior to conscience. Okay, so that's the first point. And if you got that, you don't have to stay around. You may want to hear the other respondents who will have something much more to say. The second is that Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologiae, asked the question, is conscience a faculty? Is it a power? And he says, no, it isn't. It's an act. And he suggests there's something prior to conscience as well. So when I start talking about Aquinas and say that I think Aquinas is right talking about conscience as an act, I'm giving you an indication of where I'm going. These are just 2 preliminary remarks because going over my paper, I thought, well, am I clear? Hopefully that's more clear. Let me get started. I want to share with you an ongoing discovery. Years ago, I became worried about teaching conscience formation. It seemed to me that we were designing conscience formation courses as if the students just needed a number of instructions. I began to see that we were thinking of conscience as a disposition, as something the students had that we wanted to form. Now I'm beginning to think that conscience is an act, and it follows from some other disposition. I say this because I see some students who are responsive to the need for moral assistance, but others do not. If all have consciences, why do some respond and others do not? Moreover, what if they all take courses on conscience formation? Why is it that afterwards some respond to the need for moral assistance and others do not? Failing to respond in the first place seems to be the predominant failure in human history. At least it appears that way in the Bible. People do not fail by responding. Rather, they fail beforehand. They fail to bother to respond in the first place. Think of the Good Samaritan parable. The priest and the Levite pass by the man on the road. Or think about the goats and the sheep in the account of Matthew. The goats don't see the hungry. They don't see the naked. Or think of the rich man who steps over Lazarus in Luke. None of them respond in the first place. Is there something that starts the ball rolling? Is there something about conscience formation that precedes the act of conscience, which considers, what am I to do? Is there something we are not forming that eventually gets one to act in the first place? I think the problem is that we think of the beginning of moral action as the conscience. But now I believe that only after being vulnerably disposed to the other, and then subsequently recognizing the other, do we act in conscience. In other words, I think there are two steps before acting in conscience. First, being vulnerably disposed, and second, then actually recognizing. These are the preconditions to the conscience act. Let's return to the Good Samaritan parable. I do not know if the priest and the Levite could have acted in conscience, but I do know two things. Neither in their humanity were vulnerably disposed to the injured man, and neither gave him the recognition that he was injured and in need. On the other hand, the Good Samaritan's first recognition of the injured man gives evidence of his underlying vulnerability to the wounded man. Then after he does recognize the man as being in need, then he in conscientiously went about the details of what he needed to do. After he recognizes the man, he knows he has to clean the man's wounds. He has to get him to a safe place. He has to make inquiries about the appropriate place in which to leave him. He has to negotiate and secure from the innkeeper his oversight of the injured man. He has to dispense with his funds. He has to redesign his return so that he could return to this particular inn so as to take this man with him, etc., etc. The Good Samaritan's conscience got a workout, but the work of conscience was the particular reflection of not whether to respond, but what to do. Whether to respond happened when his vulnerable disposition recognized the man. The recognition led then to the conscience question. Now that I've recognized, now what do I do? That's the question of conscience. One reason why we do not see what precedes the conscience is because, disregarding Thomas Aquinas, we think of conscience as essentially either a faculty or a disposition and an act. We think of conscience as something one has and as something one does. I know I did, but I don't anymore. I think something precedes conscience, a vulnerable disposition, and then the act of vulnerability, that is recognizing another. I think now that conscience is not a power or a faculty or a disposition, but simply an act, just as Thomas argued in the Summa. I think we act in conscience when we descend into the particulars about what our moral response should be. All ethics courses are effectively about conscience, of what constitutes the right conduct toward the other, the common good, or even the self. Ethics effectively helps form conscience for its right action. That moral response is what I am now calling the conscience act, is much different from the previous matter that I am now calling the recognition. In an article prior to the one on conscience, Thomas asked about a closely related aspect of the moral life called, in Latin, synderesis. There he argued that synderesis is a habit that inclines us to the good, and that while it incites us to the good and murmurs at evil, this initial habit is for Thomas what eventually launches the act of conscience in its deliberations. Like Thomas, I want to argue that something precedes conscience that inclines us toward the good, toward the neighbor. Thomas calls this inclination synderesis. I want to explore what that something indifferent, more contemporary terminology is, so that we can better educate our students in what we call conscience formation. What the goats, what the rich man, what the priest and the Levite have in common is that they were not vulnerable to and did not recognize the other, that is, the homeless and the naked, poor Lazarus, and the wounded stranger outside the city. If they had recognized these humans as such, then they would have needed in conscience to figure out what ethics wanted from them. I believe that these instances of overlooking others happen precisely because these agents were not prompted to see or imagine the others as like them. In that same moment, they gave themselves permission not to be bothered by the other or by their situation. Lacking the vulnerable disposition and the habit of recognizing these people, they passed them by. They needed to know ethics, but only for those whose dignity they recognized, the priest and the Levite for their colleagues, Dives for his business partners, but they are not interested in ethics for those whom they do not recognize. If they recognize them as worthy, then they needed ethics, they thought. What we have to address is their particular indifference, their lack of vulnerability and recognition. We need to tap into what could be their vulnerability and then train them to recognize others beyond their family, beyond their colleagues, and beyond their caste. In what follows, I want to first examine vulnerable dispositions and then recognition. So my first major point, vulnerability. Like many others, when I first thought of vulnerability, I considered it singularly as being wounded, as primarily a condition that raises alarm and concern. From the writings of Judith Butler, among others, I began to see vulnerability as less wounded and more responsive. When I recognize the word vulnerable does not mean having been wounded, but rather being able to be wounded. Then I began to see how it means being exposed to the other. In this sense, vulnerability is the human condition that allows me to hear, encounter, receive, or respond to the other, even to the point of being injured. Being human is being vulnerable. Being vulnerable should not be reduced to being precarious. That is, being in an unstable or risky situation where the possibility or the continuation of harm occurs. Butler realizes that too many people think of vulnerability as first being in an unstable context. She rather wants us to understand that all of us as human beings are vulnerable to one another. And precisely when one's vulnerability is at risk, we vulnerably respond. So wisely, she distinguishes precarity as a moment of risk for the vulnerable person. She notes precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency. Certainly, in being vulnerable, we have the capacity to encounter and respond to another whose vulnerability is precarious, as in the Prodigal Son Parable, where the son's own precarity is evident. But while the beginning of that parable focuses on the younger brother's precarity, the center of the parable emerges as we recognize the vulnerability of the father, who recognizes his son in the distance, embraces him, reincorporates him, and works to restore all that was unstable, threatened, and exposed and jeopardized in his son. Like the vulnerable Good Samaritan, the vulnerable father recognizes his son as the precarious one, a humanity not recognized by those who left him to eat with the pigs. Butler recognizes how fundamentally foundational vulnerability is. She writes, ethical obligation not only depends on our vulnerability to the claims of others, but establishes us as creatures who are fundamentally defined by that ethical relation. Vulnerability is what defines and establishes us as capable of being moral among one another. Again, emphasizing the priority of vulnerability, she contends this ethical relation is not a virtue that I have or exercise. It is prior to any sense of the self. It is not as discrete individuals that we honor this ethical relation. I am already bound to you. And this is what it means to be the self I am. I am receptive to you in ways that I cannot fully predict or control. Think, for instance, when you hear a cry for help. Vulnerability essentially then is what most qualifies myself as one among others. Butler returns to the priority of vulnerability as prior even to the moan from another in need. She writes, and this is a paragraph that I find very powerful. You call upon me, and I answer. But if I answer, it was only because I was already answerable. That is, this susceptibility and vulnerability constitutes me at the most fundamental level, and is there, we may say, prior to any deliberate decision to answer the call. In other words, one has to be already capable of receiving the call before actually answering it. In this sense, she writes, ethical responsibility presupposes ethical responsiveness. Our vulnerability is our answerability, what allows and prompts us to recognize, to respond, to communicate, in short, to love. Theologically, Butler's natural created answerableness resonates with a variety of creation narratives that capture the vulnerability of the human. Though not from a theologian, T.H. White's wonderful The Once and Future King provides an account of creation that captures it beautifully. God gathers all the embryos, and this is how he tells the story of the creation. God gathers all the embryos of each and every species of animal life. And on the sixth day, all these embryos are in God's room, if you will. And God offers each embryo the opportunity to ask for an addition that will distinguish their species. The giraffe embryo asks for and receives a long neck for tree food. The porcupine asks for quills for protection. And so it goes for the entire animal kingdom for the entire sixth day. The last embryo is the human, who, when asked by God what he wants, responds, I think that you made me in the shape which I now have for reasons best known to yourselves, and that it would be rude to change. I will stay a defenseless embryo all my life. God is delighted with Adam and lets the human embryo have no particular protection, to be the most vulnerable of all newborns. And God says, as for you, Adam, you will look like an embryo till they bury you. Behind White's imaginative portrayal of creation is his remarkable vision of the human embryo as the bearer of human vulnerability. By positing the human as willing to remain vulnerable, White is able to disclose further God's delight in that the human now is in God's image, precisely because of the decision to stay as a defenseless embryo all my life. White concludes his account with God revealing to the human, God says, Adam, eternally undeveloped, you will always remain potential in our image, able to see some of our sorrows and to feel some of our joys. We are partly sorry for you, Adam, but partly hopeful. Human dignity, rooted in the image of God, participates in the vulnerability of God. This insight of our vulnerability being connected to God's resonates with the late Enda McDonough, the Irish theologian who just died, a dear friend of mine. And he did a book called Vulnerable to the Holy in Faith, Morality, and Art. There he begins his treatment on vulnerability with God. God reveals to us God's self as vulnerable by the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, his life in Nazareth, and his death on Golgotha. Thus, sounding like White, McDonough writes that to be made in God's image is to be made vulnerable. Our dignity is rooted in God's vulnerability. My second point, recognition. Besides theology and philosophy, the literature on vulnerability expands elsewhere. For this presentation, I want to turn to the work on gender and domination by the psychoanalyst and feminist theorist Jessica Benjamin, who reflected on infancy and mutual recognition among infants. Mutual recognition is the central experience of infants among infants. After being the object of the attention of people much bigger than themselves, mutual recognition is that time where an infant finally encounters another infant that seems very much like itself, and yet not. They want to touch the face of the other child. They are fascinated that this child in front of them is just like them. They mutually recognize each other. And in that moment, they recognize their humanity. Benjamin writes, mutual recognition is the most vulnerable point in the process of differentiation. She adds, in mutual recognition, the subject accepts the premise that others are separate, but nonetheless share like feelings and intentions. In this work, Benjamin sought to explore ways of restoring mutual recognition as a defining key for understanding right relationship between the genders. In a more recent work in 2017, she turns again to mutual recognition and, among other matters, finds that the language of vulnerability key for recuperating and restoring the experience of mutual recognition. As we mature, the experience of mutual recognition can and should happen time and again as part of our growth as moral agents. The mutual recognition in infancy becomes the foundation for subsequent expressions of due recognition whenever we encounter humanity in its greatest precarity or neglect. From that first recognition where we acknowledge the others and our own humanity, we learn to develop a sense that the other in need is another human being. Of course, as we saw earlier in the biblical stories, overlooking the humanity of another is what gives us the unfortunate permission to withhold due recognition. Thus, the work of education is to help one another to be vulnerable and vigilant enough so that due recognition and appropriate response to the other is actualized as the worthy alternative to the customary but harmful stance of overlooking or neglect. The philosopher Patty McQueen explains recognition as an insight and a practice that develops. He gives us 3 stages, going first from being an awakening, second, to making a form of identification, and third, to appreciating a responsible relationship that broadens our self-understanding. He writes, the term recognition has several distinct meanings. First, an act of intellectual apprehension, such as when we recognize we have made a mistake, or we recognize the influence of religion on American politics. In other words, it's a new apprehension, recognize. The second is as a form of identification, such as when we recognize a friend in the street. And the third is the act of acknowledging or respecting another being, such as when we recognize someone's status, someone's achievements, someone's needs, or someone's rights. The philosophical and political notion of recognition predominantly refers to this third level and is often taken to mean that not only is recognition an important means of valuing or respecting another, it is also fundamental to understanding ourselves. McQueen's move from recognizing someone familiar to giving recognition to one to whom it is due is, I think, the threshold into the moral life. What we learn in infancy is literally a first moral lesson. In our vulnerability, we can recognize that we are related one to another. Then we move from an awakening to a form of identification. Later, as children, we realize that that form of identification calls us to a form of responsiveness, especially when the other is neglected, in need, or oppressed. The awakening to and the identification with another's humanity is therefore the first steps across the moral threshold. We can return now to the Prodigal Son Parable to uncover recognition's rich relationship with both the vulnerable and the familiar. In the parable, as the vulnerable father attends to the prodigal, he remains vulnerable to his oldest son, who does not suffer from precarity, but suffers from dominance, which expresses itself in his resentment. Still, we should not think that the father is surprised by the oldest son's resentment. When he sees his youngest son in the distance, he knows, the father knows, that his movement to that son will surely trigger the oldest son's own insecurities that are covered by his dominance. Here then, we need to recognize the father's own vulnerability that anchors both sons. The stability in the story is the vulnerable father, as the precarious son returns and the resentful one tries to leave. The enduringly vigilant, attentive, and responsive father is so because he is vulnerable. So when the older son refers to his brother as, quote, that son of yours, the father wants him to recognize his brother and says, this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. But the brother needs to be vulnerable before he can recognize. Without that vulnerability, due recognition just does not happen. One of my own doctoral students reintroduced me to the notion of due recognition. In a paper he delivered in Rwanda in the summer of 2019, a paper called 25 Years After the Genocide, Can Rwanda Embrace an Ethics of Recognition? The Nigerian Hilary Naiwana developed this fundamental insight because he wanted to recognize not only the victims of the genocide, but also the reformed, penitent perpetrators. He noted that in Rwanda, there was recognition for those harmed, but not recognition for those who, through restorative justice, was seeking reinsertion back into their community, wanting to be recognized as such. Till now, they remain ignored, overlooked, and neglected. Naiwana notes that our human dignity is established socially by an appreciation of our interrelatedness. Borrowing from Charles Taylor, he argues that in the context of shared human dignity, due recognition is not then just a courtesy we owe people, which we can refer or reserve at will, but rather a vital human need. When we fail to give due recognition, we often add to the oppression of the other, whose own situation might well be related to our own, even though we fail to acknowledge it. Recognition becomes then a moment not only of the engaged awareness of another's situation, but also of the self-reflective awareness of my relationship to that other and her or his situation. Now, my third and final point, reverting the gaze, G-A-Z-E. In 1932, Reinhold Niebuhr warned ethicists that they lacked, quote, an understanding of the brutal character of the behavior of all human collectives and the power of self-interest and collective egoism in all intergroup relations. It's a powerful sentence. It's been quoted among ethicists time and again. Whether it's paid attention to, recognized is another matter. But here he says that we lack an understanding of the brutal character of the behavior of all human collectives and the power of self-interest and collective egoism in an all intergroup relations. The title of the book is Moral Man and Immoral Society. And the argument is that when we stand alone, you and I may be pretty good, but in our own societies, there is social influence that keeps us and gives us permission to not recognize anybody but those who are at our level or above. In that book, he insisted that we do not see the limitations of the human imagination, the easy subservience of reason to prejudice and passion, and the consequent persistence of irrational egoism, particularly in group behavior. In many ways, we go on teaching today, nearly 90 years later, failing to heed the powers that empower, quote, the inequalities of privilege that are greater than could possibly be defended rationally. It is in the interest of such forces that we continue to fail to recognize those whose inequities pay the price of our privilege. No wonder then that we rarely recognize. And yet reason is often invoked precisely to defend such inequalities of privilege, and thus to keep us from giving due recognition to others. Well, another student of mine, Kate Ward, who teaches at Marquette University and who knows well Professor Susan Wood, gave a stunning critique of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. She described Smith's contempt for those whining and melancholy moralists, that's what Smith called them, who call attention to the suffering of distant others, noting how Smith considers the moralist's sympathy for those with misfortunes, quote, as absurd and unreasonable and irresistibly unnatural. The father of capitalism understood well the importance of keeping our gaze from those who are victims of our privilege. More recently, Isabel Wilkerson, in her magnificent book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, takes us further than neighbour and provides us with the image of what she calls the wordless usher in a theater, whose flashlight keeps our gaze focused, not letting our eyes avert to any lower caste whom we dare not recognize. She writes, as we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feeling or morality. It's about power, which groups have it and which do not. It's about resources, which caste is seen as worthy of them and which are not, who gets to acquire and control them and who does not. It is about respect, authority, and assumptions of competence, who is accorded these and who is not. The power of Wilkerson's arguments are that they remind us how prevalent the forces are that keep us from reverting our gaze and discovering a mutual recognition in the other whose condition we are socially trained to ignore. Recognition is therefore the act that liberates the vulnerability of the agent and the other in the face of the distorting power of the caste that structure our lives. Yet before we teach recognition, we need to educate our students about just how pervasively the wordless usher deflects our gaze of due recognition. Let me give you a few examples of my own discovery of the prevalence of the politics, what I call the politics of overlooking. From the church's sexual abuse scandal, from the cover-ups and shields at university, from racial injustice, and finally, from the most ignored people in the world, the homeless. These are four examples of lacking recognition. In 2002, as I am a priest in Boston, I learned, for instance, how many letters of a woman named Margaret Gallant reported to the Chancery the abuse of her nephews and others, and how those letters went unanswered and unrecognized for decades. We later learned that the practice of overlooking these arresting reports was universal. Think of Chile, hitting its zenith when the Pope himself refused to recognize the reports against the Chilean bishops, denouncing the letters, he said, as calumny. Every instance of a national breakthrough on sexual abuse was precisely a recognition of the politics of neglecting the claims of vulnerable relatives wanting to protect their children. The second example, the work of university ethics argues that though universities teach the professional ethics of every corporate field but its own, its disinterest in ethics appears when a scandal erupts. Yet even then, the university engages a politics of overlooking the claims. For instance, Megan McCabe begins her essay on campus rape culture with these words: despite pervasive sexual violence against women, especially the extensive problem of rape on college campus, there is virtually no Catholic response. There's no recognition. More recently, I have argued that the contingent faculty and community colleges themselves are both grossly neglected by tenured faculty who conveniently overlook the situations of either. Remarkably, with the help of its siloed context, the university has consistently promoted a culture of diverting recognition. Third, on race. Black Lives Matter is effectively a clarion call that white America has politically neglected the physical and often deadly assault on Black lives by police and by white supremacists. The protests are shocking precisely because they want to awaken in others a recognition of the situation. Thus, in Rochester, naked protesters seated and shackled with spit hoods called attention to the vulnerability of Daniel Prude, who was naked and only wearing a spit hood when he asphyxiated after being held face down on pavement for more than 2 minutes by those charged with protecting us. Black Lives Matter is a call to recognize. Katie Walker Grimes wants us to recognize not only that Black Lives Matter, but also the consistent and pervasive violence of unrecognized white supremacy. She insists that we recognize that in the churches in which we pray, where she writes, since the racially segregated space of the United States operates as a habitat of white supremacy. The vice of white supremacy pervades the church's corporate body and thereby permeates all of its practices, including those of baptism and the Eucharist. My last example is personal. From when I was among 20 Catholic ethicists invited by a man named Mark McGreevy, the founder of the Institute for Global Homelessness, to a conference in Rome in 2017 on street homelessness. He initiated the conference informing us that not one ethicist in the entire world had ever bothered to recognize in her or his writings the plight of the homeless. We write a great deal. You heard, I have 400 essays, for God's sake. But it wasn't until recently any work on the homeless until I went to this conference. The conference was a call to consider whence the politics of overlooking the homeless, a fairly universal practice, even by those dedicated to recognizing those on the margins. We ethicists are dedicated to recognizing those on the margins, and we never even wrote or considered the plight of the homeless. Such is the way we do not see them in our midst. Ultimately, I believe that educators must attend to the constraints of the politics of negligence and aim to bring students experientially to the insight of mutual recognition time and again. whether it's through art, immersion programs, accompanying learning, tutorials, informal sharing, or simply exploring in class what it means to see a dead boy's body washed up on a beach. We need to not miss those moments where we help students cross the threshold and understand that it is only by recognizing that we capture the vulnerability and answerability that is within us and the other. I turn then to Thomas again, who argues that the life of perfection is 3 stages: to resist vice, to develop virtue, and to perfect the habitual practice. These are not separate stages of resisting vice, developing virtue, and perfecting the habitual practice. As he says, as we struggle to perfect the practice, we recognize yet again the vices within us. So as I sat in Rome, I realized yet again that I failed to recognize, in that instance, the homeless. As Niebuhr, Grimes, and Wilkerson warns us, we will never have an unflinching gaze. But then the scriptures taught us that as well. We need to explore much more often the multitudinous ways that our students and we get accustomed to the normal, where those beneath us go unnoticed because we think we are above them. In a way, we need to teach them and one another lessons for the practice of recognizing a new virtue of vigilance, or what the wonderful late Johann Baptist Metz called a culture of sensitivity and a mysticism of painfully opened eyes that must not only focus on the closest neighbor, but especially on the strange others. In his book on recognition, The Mysticism of Open Eyes When Spirituality Breaks Out, he reminds us that recognition can be unsettling, but brings us closer to Christ, a point to close this essay. In the Gospels, recognition is always connected to Christ, to the Christological. For Matthew, because the sheep recognized the hungry, they were saved for feeding Christ. As Augustine and others taught, the parable of the Good Samaritan is really the gospel of Christ saving wounded Adam. That some of the most important parables in the gospel are on recognition is not a surprise. Indeed, that is what the gospels ask of us, to recognize in Jesus the Christ. Recognition is, in our tradition, the way we find in him ourselves. Once we allow ourselves to be vulnerable to the other, we begin the work and life of conscience. Conscience finds its foundation by being first vulnerable, open to the responsive, to the other, capacious to the variety of ways that we are called to be human. In that vulnerability, we become like the Good Samaritan, able to hear the cry for help, or like the father who sees his prodigal on the horizon. The birth of Christian conscience is in the vulnerability of being human. But conscience needs to act, and recognition gives conscience both its path and its legs. By recognition, the conscience is first awakened to the other. In that awakening, conscience recognizes the other as sharing in the very vulnerability of humanity, and in that moment identifies with the other. That identification, intimately linked to the early experience of mutual recognition, becomes then the prompt for conscience to respond to others in all their need and fragility, as well as in their capacity and promise. In the story of the Good Samaritan, we get a glimpse of his vulnerability and his conscientious recognition of the wounded man. Still, the details of the narrative need to be filled out. Those details about cleansing and bandaging the wounds, the search for a place for the wounded man to mend, the even more difficult investigation for an innkeeper capable of trust, care, and prudence, the finding of the funds to return to the inn, the resolution to bring the wounded man to the Samaritan's homeland, and the eventual incorporation of the wounded man into the land of Samaria. All these meticulous details are the stuff of conscience, the working out of human vulnerability, wherein we recognize and live our shared humanity. And therein is the work of moral education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Keenan. We'll now turn to our respondents for their presentations, and we'll just go by the way they're listed on the panel. One of the tragedies of this COVID period is that we can't physically see and we can't meet each other in person. But one of the benefits is that we can enjoy each other's presence and wisdom from afar. So we have Professor Keenan from Boston, and now we can welcome Professor Sturla Stalset from Norway, who's in I think 6-hour time zone from us here in Toronto. Although our temperature and our weather is much warmer than I think what he has up in Norway. Professor Stalset is a professor of society, religion, and diaconal studies at MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society in Oslo, Norway. His research interests include globalization, migration, vulnerability, faith policies, and political as well as liberationist theologies. For many years, he was professionally engaged in solidarity work and diaconal service in Latin America and in Norway. His publications include the books The Crucified and the Crucified, a study in the liberation Christology of John Sobrino, Spirits of Globalization, the Growth of Pentecostalism and Experiential Spiritualities in a Global Age, and he'll help me if I pronounce this wrong, Religion I Urologi Tider, Globalisering, Religiositet og Sårbarhet, and maybe he can translate that title for us. So we welcome Professor Stalset.
Thank you so much, and good evening, all of you from Oslo. It's a great pleasure for me to join this conversation, and to not least the privilege to be invited to respond to the wonderful essay and presentation that Professor Keenan has just given to us. Yes, the Norwegian title of the book was well pronounced. It deals with religion in turbulent times, and globalization, religiosity, and vulnerability is the subtitle of it. So it's really a topic that I have been very much concerned with for a couple of decades, really, the issue of vulnerability in different situations, ethically, theologically, politically, and the tension or the relationship between vulnerability and security. So it was for me a great pleasure both to be earlier to be able to respond to Jared Ryan's fine work on this topic, and now to also to listen to and learn from you, Professor Keenan. I have what I particularly liked with your presentation. Now there were many very rich ideas, and I like the connection you make between vulnerability and conscience and recognition. I think there is a lot of wisdom and more to be explored in those connections that you make, and making seeing conscience as an act and vulnerability as prior condition to that act, I think is a very good starting point. And also I really would like to highlight the way in which you express that recognition is not just a vulnerable act, but it's actually also vulnerability acting. The basis for that recognition is vulnerability itself, which I think is something really to reflect on. And connecting that to the work of education, I think, is also very helpful. Now, I would like to briefly raise 3 points, 3 concerns that really, I think, invites for further reflection and critical appraisal. And the first and most basic point is the tension, perhaps, or the duality between being vulnerable and acting vulnerably. At some stages in the essay or in the presentation, there seems to me to be a certain reason to question what is going on. How do we pass from being vulnerable to acting vulnerably? I think that's the challenge, sort of crossing the threshold from a prior condition, as you quoted also Judith Butler on this, that prior to any deliberate decision, and still it is not just this passivity, it further passes on to responsivity, responsibility, resilience, even also resistance, and then further on to affirmation and even the productive ethical act of affirmation of the right and life of the other. How is that passage taking place? You were saying that the Samaritan acted vulnerably out of his own vulnerability. That is an interesting interpretation, but it's not clear from the text that there was a difference in the vulnerability of the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan. So how come, again, that the Samaritan manages somehow to pass from being vulnerable to acting recognizably or ethically or vulnerably? So that's a basic question that I have. The second is perhaps to problematize vulnerability, not in the conventional sense that, I mean, that we are past that point in which vulnerability is a problem, but vulnerability is or vulnerability is merely weakness, but vulnerability is also a critique. It's a judgment. It could be seen as God's judgment on us, and particularly the vulnerability of the other is an accusation, like Levinas also would say very, very strongly towards us. You know, the vulnerability of the other person becomes an accusation and the judgment from God on our situation, and hence there is a provocation related to vulnerability, and there is also a malcontent, a dis-ease related to vulnerability, which I think we also need to deal with quite critically. And that leads me to the third point, which is rather on recognition, because as we know from Hegel, recognition, the struggle of recognition is really a life and death struggle between the master and the slave, and it's not a harmonious process. Recognition, it's a conflict, and of course Honneth is underlining this with the struggle for recognition, and that how does that sort of challenge the way in which we interconnect conscience, recognition, and vulnerability? Maybe there is a struggle for us to recognize our own vulnerability? Is that struggle what we need to cross the threshold? Because too easily we may speak of embracing our own vulnerability, but vulnerability goes beyond our own awareness of the vulnerability. It's as you said, a prior condition even before our answerability to the call of the other. So that I would really like to learn more from you and discuss with you. How can we describe that crossing the threshold further on to the ethical act, because that's the work of formation and education, of course, but it still is something, there is something given, something prior, which goes beyond our efforts in a way. So, and that's of course also a way of entering into the spirituality of vulnerability and the ways in which vulnerability and the ability to be acting vulnerably is in some sense also a prior gift. So that would be my comments at this stage, and thank you again so much for your very rich essay and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we will thank you very much. Now we will move to Professor Hilde Koster as our next respondent. Professor Koster is Associate Professor of Ecological Theology at the University of St. Michael's College and the University of Toronto. A native from the Netherlands, she holds a BA and MDiv from the University of Groningen, a THM from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a doctorate from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Dr. Koster's publications on theology and ecofeminism and environmental ethics have appeared in Theology Today, Modern Theology, the Journal of Religion, the Anglican Theological Review, and Scriptura. Among her book-length co-edited or authored publications are The Gift of Theology, the contributions of Catherine Tanner, Planetary Solidarity, Global Women's Voices on Christian Doctrine and Climate Justice, and T.N.T. Clark, Handbook of Christian Theology and Climate Change. She's also the co-editor of the T.N.T. Clark book series, Theology, Gender, and Ecology, published through Bloomsbury. At St. Michael's, Dr. Koster is the newly appointed director of the Elliott Allen Institute for Theology and Ecology. So please, Professor Koster, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so very much for that generous introduction. And thank you, Dr. Keenan, for a very thoughtful, insightful, and timely presentation on conscience, recognition, and vulnerability. It really is very hard to do justice to such a rich paper. There is simply so much there. So I'm very grateful to my Norwegian colleague as well for drawing out some very interesting points for further discussion. I'm going to focus today on two issues, 2 points. First, I will discuss Dr. Keenan's proposal in relation to teaching climate change and especially climate justice. Mm-hmm. And then second, I raise the issue as to how the discourse of sin may intersect with the issues Dr. Keenan's paper raises on vulnerability and recognition. And I did not push quite far enough to talk about grace, but I think it's very interesting connections, especially with the doctrine of justification. Dr. Keenan reminds us that to live is to be vulnerable. The fact of our fragility is laid bare by the many crises of our world. The still barely contained pandemic worsening in countries like India, persistent and relentless racial violence, and accelerating ecological loss due to our climate crisis. Against this background, Dr. Keenan's presentation pushes us to think deep and hard about the human condition and the development of conscience, not only, but especially in the classroom. How might our teaching help sensitize students to the pressing needs of our world? I deeply resonate with the problem of teaching students to care deeply that prompted Dr. Keenan's paper. I once titled a college course on theology and climate justice, Do We Care? Dr. Keenan's paper made me realize the extent to which the title of that course expresses how wrong-headed my approach had been. I assumed wrongly, I now know, that if only I presented students with the climate data and the evidence of climate change related suffering, they would stop consuming meat and radically change all their other fossil fuel intensive behavior, which of course some did do, but most did not. And let me clarify, my students were lovely and many of them actually became agents for change. So this was more my issue than theirs. But teaching on climate change and climate justice, it turns out, is actually a perfect case study for the issues on development of conscience Dr. Keenan's paper addresses. Leaving the willful and hateful deniers to the side, the issue with climate change is not so much that people do not respond, though it certainly is that, but that they do not have a way to be bothered that does not make them fall apart. Human-induced climate change is deeply unsettling for what it tells us about our interdependence. To make climate-privileged people like ourselves to not just care about, but also act on climate change means that we need to acknowledge that we are contributing to the suffering of climate vulnerable people elsewhere in the world simply by living our day-to-day fossil-fueled lives. We do, moreover, have the nagging sense that our individual actions may not make a difference that truly matters. Climate change then seems to transcend our individual moral agency. Studies on ecological anxiety, moreover, have shown that apathy and denial can be seen as a defense mechanism. The Finnish theologian Panu Pakala, for instance, suggests that appealing mainly to guilt while failing to address underlying emotions and existential questions is a counterproductive and even dangerous way of dealing with climate change. It may, for instance, strengthen the appeal of authoritarian leaders who promises that climate change is not real, or increase patterns of unsustainable consumption. Dr. Keenan's paper seems to align well with this moral psychological approach to thinking about climate change action. He insists that prior to asking how we should act, we attend first to our vulnerability and our ability to recognize our common vulnerability in others. In Dr. Keenan's words, it is, quote, embracing our vulnerability what makes us answerable. Our vulnerability is our answerability, what allows and prompts us to recognize, to respond, to communicate, in short, to love, end quote. The work of education then is to, quote, help one another to be vulnerable and be vigilant enough so that due recognition and appropriate response to the other is actualized as the worthy alternative to the customary but harmful stance of overlooking or neglect, end quote. This definition of the work of education to me seems to mean, among many other things, that we find pedagogical tools to attend to climate anxiety and grief in the classroom and create opportunities for healing, for restoring some sense of well-being that allows us to be vulnerable. Journal to connect with our vulnerability vis-a-vis climate change. There are many ways to do this, and there's lots of literature on it. Journaling, spending time outside, mindfulness, and contemplative prayer are all some good examples. Yet while I find Dr. Keenan's elaborations on vulnerability and recognition as the preconditions to act useful, I wonder at the same time whether the language of vulnerability and recognition is sufficient. Does it allow us to not just name, but also condemn our own complicity in structures perpetuating climate injustice? And what about these structures itself? Drawing on Isabel Wilkerson's fabulous book, and I just want to commend Dr. Keenan for all the fabulous feminist theorists and philosophers he engages with. That's just wonderful. So drawing on Isabel Wilkerson's fabulous book, Cast, The Origins of Our Discontent, Dr. Keenan observes that our ability to give due recognition is typically blocked by societal structures and mechanisms of privilege. He offers Wilkerson's image of the wordless usher whose flashlight keeps our gaze focused, not letting our eyes avert to any lower caste whom we dare not recognize. We are, in other words, socially trained to be morally oblivious, to avert our gaze and ignore the plight of the other. It is, Keenan insists, the work of Christian ethics to open our students' eyes to the reality and workings of these structures. While I agree that we should not rehearse the debilitating language of guilt, the discourse of sin, I think, allows us to see how our sight is not just blocked by these structures, but how our moral self is caught up with it, as indeed Ronald Niebuhr insisted. The Lutheran ethicist Cynthia Moa-Lobeda talks about the moral oblivion vis-a-vis climate change, as a collective manifestation of Luther's definition of sin as a self turned in upon self. She observed that, quote, we have as a society become so addicted to our consumption-oriented ways that we close our hearts and minds to the death and destruction required to sustain them, end quote. In other words, the structures Keenan describes are not just obstacles to developing our moral conscience. We are caught up in them in ways that is indeed often invisible to us, but we also have a stake in them as well. So that's my point. It's not just that we are somehow they are just blocking us, but we also are invested in them. The feminist theologian Joy McDougall offers the very helpful metaphor here, not for this, of speaking of the bondage of the I, the bondage of her vision, and the bondage of the I, the bondage of herself. The discourse of sin, I think, sensitizes us to this conditioned reality, to this double bondage. Thus, while I agree that we need to open our students' eyes to the wordless usher, the language of sin, I think, would be helpful to flesh out better our responsibility towards these social structures. While sin often is understood as individual wrongdoing, the Christian tradition has always understood it as collective. Also, following Moe Lobeda, I suggest, therefore, that we understand sin, especially as being social, as being collective, by way of structural violence theory. Naming sin as structural violence allows us to see both the violence that certain groups and people experience as the result of unequal distribution of power and privilege, but it also helps us understand the complicity of those who fail to take responsibility. It allows us to name these experiences as interconnected and hence to see how all of our lives are caught up in these structures in different ways and to different degrees. In a world that adds, because of the pandemic, white supremacy and climate change, all our lives are precarious. We are not just vulnerable, we are constantly at risk. And so understanding what our place is vis-a-vis these systems might offer us a way of better understanding how it is we are at risk, and also why it is we are not risking to be vulnerable. So that was actually my point. And I want to return with close with an observation about education. Maybe the reason that education has become such an ambivalent site for educating students about conscience and developing students' conscience is because the institutions of higher learning have themselves become tools that on the one hand give the message that if only we succeed within its walls, we can minimize our societal risk. And yet on the other hand, these institutions relentlessly put young people at risk financially. And they are also extremely exclusionary. No wonder our students, I'm often wondering this myself, do not dare to be vulnerable. There simply is too much at stake. So naming the human condition by way of the discourse of sin, I believe, adds the sense that our divisive structures keeping in place inequity and indifference, apathy and denial vis-a-vis climate suffering are fundamentally at odds with the fullness of the gift of God's creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Koster, and her presentation reminded me that she's also, although she's at St. Michael's, she's also at a distance from us, and we could benefit from her presentation. She's, for those of you who know geography and can triangulate, she is currently 4 hours south of Winnipeg and 3.5 hours away from Minnesota. So we'll leave it for you to figure out where she's at, and I may reveal that location at the end there. But thank you very much. And now we'll introduce our next speaker, Professor Jared Ryan. He's new to the faculty of Regis College, a Jesuit priest. He is the director of the basic degree programs at Regis and assistant professor of political theology, having joined Regis in 2020, completing his doctoral studies in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford. His studies were supervised by Professors Werner Jeanrond and Graham Ward. Prior to arriving at Regis, Gerard was a visiting research fellow at Trinity College Dublin, and he had also served for many years in the L'Arche community. His current research explores recognition theories and vulnerability studies as resources for a theological understanding of mutual accompaniment. And he's also currently working on a book on political theology. So the floor is all yours, Professor Ryan.
Thank you, Professor Skira, and thank you, Professor Keenan. I very much appreciated your strategic use of vulnerability as not only a function of openness towards the moment of recognition, but also in the exercise of conscience. And in doing so, you signal the positive role of vulnerability in formation, counteracting its more ambiguous and precarious identification that some disciplines and authors choose to emphasize. Beginning as you do with scripture and its universal norms, you are returning us, whether those in ethics or fundamental theology, to the question and reality of vulnerability. Whilst this line of inquiry has had significant traction in a variety of Christian theologies, it continues to be an emerging and exciting field of inquiry, which your paper captured so well. Beginning with scripture, you endorse Johann Baptist Metz's priority of biblical witness in any fundamental, practical, and ethical theology. My remarks concern three insights that you have offered to us this afternoon. Number one, the turn toward vulnerability as the capacity to encounter and embrace. Number two, the repairing ministry of recognition. And number three, conscience as the act of interrelational and institutional formation and transformation. So number one, the turn towards vulnerability, capacity to encounter and embrace. In laying before us the experience of vulnerability, you have provided us in a way with an ethical and theological provocation. What you have done rather brilliantly is to use this motif of vulnerability to mine an ethical response to demand of recognition. For recognition, as Charles Taylor explains, is a fundamental need, not an add-on for persons in their ongoing formation and development. We have then a turn toward vulnerability. However, I hear you also suggest that vulnerability is ambiguous, especially given the challenge around conscience formation. Nevertheless, I see too in your presentation an acknowledgement, yes, of the vulnerability of the body, of the person, but not a generalization of the vulnerable body, but an actual identification of the ways, varying ways, in which bodies and persons are vulnerable. Again, I observe Metz's voice, that all theology is biography and mutual dependence as the ground of a redefinition of ethics. Your presentation of vulnerability, recognition, and conscience emerges in a theological tradition that has at times prioritized the discrete body, the existentially singular searching person, as the preferred biography. That theological and existential impulse towards oneself first. And when I think of the singular person in the Christian tradition, we have too often elevated the ideal person. To put it another way, we have weighed heavily on a prescriptive rather than a discerning manner in the pastoral repairing of lives wounded by violence and the withholding of recognition. Whilst that regrettably remains in ways, your presentation on vulnerability has nuanced any pastoral approach to the repairing labor of recognition. And significant to this ministry is not just one's connectedness to others, but also closeness to those we encounter, the legitimacy and the rightness of unity or fraternity amongst peoples. Second, the repairing ministry of recognition. We all want this safe passage from the disposition of vulnerability to the act of recognition and the igniting of conscience. There is, therefore, labor attached to the work of recognition, the labor of conscience formation. So there is this movement from ontology to ethics, in your own words, being vulnerable, being vulnerably disposed, and then actually recognizing these are the preconditions to the conscience act. And here, James, I want to focus on your richly provocative suggestion that something, as you said, precedes conscience, that strains us toward the good, the neighbor. Yet we know that this straining towards the rightness of vulnerability is not a given, for we live indeed, to use your term, in a politics of overlooking. If I might relay the words of a fellow Irishman, the late Seamus Heaney, the power to persuade that vulnerable part of our consciousness of its rightness, in spite of the evidence of wrongness all around it, the power to remind us that we are hunters and gatherers of values, that our very solitudes and distresses are credible insofar as they too are an earnest of our veritable human being. Your assessment, in your own words, Jim, that vulnerability essentially is what most qualifies myself as one among others, and that, again, our dignity is rooted in God's vulnerability, is an urgent reminder of our ability, and not just capacity, to transcend violence and reject the allure of retribution. Black Lives Matter's demand for recognition and their vulnerability, one that comes into sharp focus in a retrospective and present rendering of history, illustrates the scandal of particular narratives of normacy operative. We recognize such disrespect in interpersonal relations, our legislative inadequacies, and the institutional indifferences and coldness to the face of the other as a visual architect of God's love and blessing already bestowed. And finally, conscience as the site of interrelational and institutional transformation. I appreciate your insight that recognition of another is no foregone outcome of any encounter with another. To manage that aspect of ourselves that chooses to respond violently to the weakness or diminishment of another, you identify the importance of education or formation to avoid overlooking the other and to get us to the moment of recognition. Yet you place before us the immense challenge facing institutions as places that actually acknowledge the importance of recognition and create cultures and contexts whereby such recognition is not only a possibility, but actively pursued. Thus, you place before us an ambitious yet urgent educational directive. And in your own words, educators must attend to the constraints of the politics of negligence and aim to bring students experientially to the insight of mutual recognition. In a real signpost as to how we might understand the formation of conscience moving forward, you remind us of that space of interiority that is not of discrete bodies turning inward. Instead, recognition liberates us from the precariousness of autonomy and individualism. And as you put it, recognition is, in our tradition, the way we find in God ourselves. It is that spotlight on educational institutions, in the broadest sense, that leaves me with a question. Can we say that vulnerability, recognition, and conscience necessitates that institutions accompany others for their own respective transformation too? And if that is true, can the disposition of vulnerability, the moment of recognition, and the act of conscience begin to reconstruct, or probably rehabilitate, our collective institutional histories so that memory can become a faculty of interpretation and a resistance against future denials of recognition? Thank you, Jim, for your very excellent paper.
Thank you to everyone for your responses. I think at this moment, what we'll do is while we wait for some of the our guests and the public to upload some of their questions in the chat function, we'll allow Professor Keenan to, if he has some comments in response to our panelists, or perhaps the other panelists would like to pose some additional questions or comments in light of each other's. So we'll turn to Professor Keenan for any comments.
So thank you very much. Let me give you some context here as to why this is so enjoyable for me to hear the three responses as ways of ferreting out especially the material that I need to bridge, that I need to connect, whether it's about sin or about moving from being vulnerable to acting vulnerably, or the last question by Jared, the question about institutional transformation. But let me just say a few things. First, by way of background. So I'm now the Vice Provost of Global Engagement here at Boston College. I got the job 4 weeks before the pandemic arrived. Global engagement during a pandemic is somewhat challenging. But it led to Bernard Genron writing me a note asking about what I could do with the University of Oslo, which I had spoken at years ago. And as a matter of fact, it was my first international lecture that I ever gave. And so I was happy to hear from Bernard, and he wanted to ask a few questions. And he said, hey, by the way, what are you writing on? And I said, oh, I just finished an essay on vulnerability and recognition. And he said, oh, I just directed a great dissertation on recognition by a Jesuit from Ireland who's working in Wash and work with vulnerable people. And it really kind of, you should contact him. And at the same time, I had known that Susan Wood had moved up to Toronto, and he said, by the way, he's at Toronto. So I tried tracking down this Jared Ryan. I wrote to him. I asked, could I see his dissertation? He sent me his dissertation. I sent him my paper. This was only a year ago, and this is why we're here. So I'm not surprised that he invited, for instance, Professor Stalset here. But, this is like fin again, begin again. I feel like I'm in familiar space. So being connected, I think, has something to do with vulnerability and recognition. And I just wanted to put a context of how really memorable this event is for me because of your comments. So the first is, I just want to say, I think that the first thing that Professor Stalset underlined is precisely what Professor Koster and Professor Ryan are raising as questions. What moves you from being vulnerable to acting vulnerably? That threshold, which I kept calling a threshold, I'm always wondering, how do you cross it? And more significantly, what each of you are asking is, how do you teach people how to cross it? Or how do you help people to understand that they're not crossing it, by the way? So I loved, for instance, Professor Costa's Do We Care? It made me laugh, because we all think that everybody cares, when as a matter of fact, when they walk out of class, half of them do and half of them don't. And you don't know who they are until they actually act, as Aristotle would tell us. So I appreciate naming this threshold. Being aware of one's vulnerability and acting on it is a very different movement. There's something that happens. And sometimes I do think it's less constructed and more intuitive. It's something about coming to one's own collective self-understanding to see how one should move. But the second point that Professor Stassos made was that awfulness, that judgment, that Hegel saw recognition as, and the failure to recognize. And think of Matthew 25, all the goats going to hell, or Dives being stuck in hell, that they encounter the awfulness of not recognizing. And I think that this is really rather important. It goes to the question of Professor Costa on sin. You know, is sin the failure to recognize? And that seems to be, that's basically my argument, but it's not been fleshed out. Professor Costa, I have to tell you, you used the word bother. My definition of sin is the failure to bother to love. And by your bringing up sin, you've helped me to root the question of bothering to recognize that bother, that strikes me as the nub of the difficulty of getting a society or an individual to bother to recognize to be considerable. The third point, so this second point, though, that Professor Salsett made about the awfulness, I want to flag something here. You know, the birth of conscience. Anybody who writes about societies that write about conscience usually find that conscience is born out of guilt. The guilty conscience is the first encounter that a human being normally has with the experience of having within them a voice of moral judgment. Most of us would not recognize a judgment that says that was really well done. It's when we discover conscience at some point in our early lives, say in our 20s, we discover that there's a capacity within ourselves to judge us negatively. And it's not other people judging us, it's ourselves doing that. And in that experience of conscience, the first experience of conscience, we are troubled by a guilty conscience. And that's the awareness that we have within us, some capacity to judge ourselves. And then that will become the capacity to actually plan our lives. There's so many books on the history of conscience that point to both Roman and Greek societies where they actually trained lawyers to look for anybody who seemed to have a conscience in the courtroom because they'd be the guilty ones. So guilt associated with conscience, I think, is really rather important. That's in many ways the wake-up call, which I think, in a way, Professor Costa was suggesting as, and in a way, Jared is mentioning in his transformational of society, that there is a call to a social sin in which we realize how deleterious our neglect has been. So I just wanted to flag that this awfulness is also the birth of conscience. However, one of the things that I'm looking for in vulnerability is I'm not looking for a terribly fragile vulnerability. I'm really looking for a capacious vulnerability. And that's what Butler's trying to do, I think, and I think she does it brilliantly. She and Erin Gielson, who wrote about Butler, I think that they realize that we have to recognize that vulnerability is a wellspring for us moving forward and toward recognizing, and that somehow therein do we recognize the human capacity to respond. I've been referring to Salsett, but I've also been bringing in Costa, and what you're bringing in sin just is so terrific for me. To this point, I write on sin. I write on. When I write in theological studies every year, a long article, but whenever I write on sin, no one reads me. If I write on race, everybody reads me. If I write on sex, everybody reads me. When I write on sin, no one wants to hear it, which is probably the nature of sin. It doesn't like to be recognized. Sin doesn't like to be recognized. And just yesterday in class, I told my graduate students that they were saying, "Where is sin?" I said, "That's what I keep asking." But I do think the language of sin would be very instrumental in helping us to appreciate why vulnerability needs to be attended to and why we have to repent over the failure to recognize. And when it is that we're complicit with the social structures that inhibit us from those acts of recognition. Because I do think that the obstacle that Professor Stahl said, that each of you have made, and that is what is the conduit from being vulnerable to acting vulnerably? What is that? That's where our brokenness is. That's where our need for paying attention to sin is really rather significant. And I guess the only last thing I'd like to say, to just give other people some space to say something, is Jared kept using the language of working. There was something heavy about this, heavy lifting implicit on it, repairing the work of recognition, for instance. And I have found in this pandemic, not just Black Lives Matter to be instructive, but also that after you realize that Black Lives Matter, you realize that you have to become an anti-racist. And that's a subsequent act of recognition. And that's really heavy lifting. You can recognize what others are saying and the validity of their lament. But when you want to be participative in the institutional transformation, for instance, that Jared is pointing out, I think that you're entering into this new way of more powerfully collaborating with one another and doing more work that requires you to be more focused educationally on those who understand that recognition is about developing a capacity, or what I call like an emerging vigilance. And I'll close on that. One of the things that I found so interesting, I do a lot of work on the history of spirituality too. And in the 16th century, during the Reformation, both the Catholic, the birth of modern Catholicism and the Protestant Reformation, both of them always talked about vigilance. And of course, vigilance was watch out for the minister or the priest of the other group who's trying to persuade you to follow them. So all the copies of all moral instructions had, you know, to be vigilant about the devil tempting you. And Jesuits were on the covers of Protestant works, and Martin Luther and Calvin were on the covers of Catholic works. But I do think that recuperating vigilance is an important virtue for doing that link that Stalsett is asking for, that doing that link that Professor Costa is calling us to, that it's, we don't want to make recognition just an act, we want it to be a habit. And if we want to know what a virtue is, I would say it's the virtue of vigilance that needs to go there. But I'm leaving you with, I mean, I'm not leaving, I'm going to stop talking. It strikes me, the key issue though, is the one that each of you are attending to, and that is how to go from being vulnerable to acting vulnerably. And I do think it's in narratives in which we see that happening, that we need to reflect on that more commonly, of when we see, for instance, right now with Black Lives Matter, we are seeing vulnerable people responding to Black Lives Matter in a way since 1619, when slave ships first came onto this coast, we had not seen before. So I think this is the time that we need to look at what does work. How do people become vulnerable? How are they vigilant? Why are they recognizing? And why is not only Black Lives Matter important, but how to be an anti-racist? So thank you.
Thank you very much for those responses. Well, before we start looking at the questions from the chat groups, if the other panelists would have a further comment or rejoinders or engage again with Professor Keenan. Yes, Professor Stalsett.
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the other responses as well, and this is really there's more than one book in this conversation, and I'm looking forward to you developing it in your further work. I would like to follow up on the I think one of the balances that we have to strike when speaking of vulnerability as a wellspring, as a force, as something strong, which I really also paradoxically strong. I really affirm that and do agree. At the same time, there is of course always the problem or the the risk of instrumentalizing and harmonizing to a certain extent the vulnerability and particularly the vulnerability of others, right? So that is something that we have to look up and be careful about, and that's why I find, and that's part of your essay as well, is touching upon it, that there's a very important distinction between vulnerability and woundedness. To be wounded is not God-given and good, but to be vulnerable is a God-given gift. It's a gift from God because it makes us human, and it makes it possible for us to respond ethically to the wounds of other people's. So that's, I think, is, to me at least, it's a helpful distinction: woundedness and vulnerability. But that leads me to the other side of it, which is also, I've been looking for what the problem sometimes with the term vulnerability is that it's directed towards the possibility of being wounded, of something negative, the impact of something negative. But the other side of that is the possibility, the gift that we have as human beings of being drawn into the positive, to have that desire to do well, to live humanly, and that we have it. The other side of vulnerability is excitability, the ability of being thrilled, to being led beyond ourselves in loving the other and desiring the other, and so sometimes we have to balance, and perhaps it's the meeting point between this is openness, is the vulnerability is the affectability in both its negative and positive dimensions. And that, my final comment would be that perhaps we could see something analogous in the senses and in the seeing. Seeing is something both passive. It's taking in what comes towards us. And it's something active. We're looking, particularly with our gaze or our sight is looking for something particular. Also, hearing and listening is different. So perhaps the being vulnerable and the acting vulnerability is something similar in being both passive and active at once.
So just to dovetail very briefly, one word that I don't, maybe somebody mentioned it, but I think the word risk is very important. In Enda McDonough's work on vulnerability, he talks about, he wanted to call the book The Risk of God. God's vulnerability is being at risk. And when you place yourself to be vulnerable, it's to be at risk. That includes the risk of being wounded. But I think it's very important to also pay attention to the people who are in positions of precarity, where they have suffered a great deal, they have been wounded. And we have to see what is vulnerability there. So I just want to flag that. And just say, though, that I think that risk is very important to understand the movement from being vulnerable to acting vulnerable.
If I can just pick up on that last comment, Professor Keenan, there's a couple questions here which have a similar thread. One relates to indigenous peoples. As you know, in Canada, we've undergone a very long and very important process of truth and reconciliation for those who've been colonized by Europeans, and those are the indigenous peoples, obviously, and in a residential school system. Another question also is related to that. It's really coming from the perspective of those who are the most vulnerable. And one of the, perhaps I'll just read one of the questions, perhaps encapsulates all these questions, is to what degree is acting vulnerably a mark of privilege? Why would someone who is consistently vulnerable through disability or skin color or gender or sexual orientation want to act vulnerably?
Yeah, I think that everybody thinks of, I mean, I think that the great contribution of Butler is to say that vulnerability is not about weakness. Vulnerability is the human condition to be open to the other. that what happens in mutual recognition is we have the touchstone of what it means to be a vulnerable human being. So I don't think that acting vulnerably is a mark of privilege. I think, as a matter of fact, we learn from people who are more in contact with their vulnerability how to be human. And I think that that's the lesson that we're looking for. Who are our teachers? And so that's why I was saying, where do we see movements? So I know as a white person from the States, watching in the middle of the pandemic, tens of thousands of African Americans protesting with masks on in the middle of a pandemic about the way there's been an assault on them. And this was a people who recognized that they needed to wake us up to something. I find that this is where sin emerges. I mean, the question is about sin. Why is it that the privileged are the ones who are awakened by we could use the old-fashioned word, by the vulnerable, those most at risk, the precarious? And yet, that's the lesson that we have to be teaching, that to learn from those who are most at risk, who are asking and waiting for some recognition of what has been happening. The birth of, and that's where sin is going to come in. That's where we're going to have the impetus for social transformation. But if we think that the answer to social questions are not going to come from the victims, then we're fools. That's what the answers to the victims come from the victims. The people who've been their oppressors have to learn what. So this is that's why, Kendi can write a book on becoming an anti-racist. Why does a vulnerable man write a book for whites so that they can become anti-racist? I don't know. But if he didn't, we wouldn't know how to become anti-racist. And so the question of vulnerability, the irony of human life, is that those who are in these situations become the teachers. Now, that's not the way it should be. I am not suggesting that's normative. I'm just suggesting that's history.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about the formation of conscious and magisterial teaching. I don't know if you had a chance to read that entirety. I think that perhaps what you've said may address that, because it does deal with the issue of those who have not been truly recognized in their mutual vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think we have to understand that church structures inhibit us from seeing the truth. There are so many instances that church structures inhibit us from seeing the racism, the homophobia, the sexism, the misogyny, and we can take church structures and use them as excuses for overlooking. I don't think that the examination of structures do not include institutions like churches and universities. In fact, I like bringing them into the fodder.
Okay, there's quite a number of questions coming in, and one of the challenges of being a moderator is trying to read through them quickly here, perhaps in a different tenor here. For Professor Keenan from one of our faculty, Regis, what are the intertextual dynamics between vulnerability and spirituality?
Well, I think it was interesting that Jared stayed on Metz. I'm just finishing this book on the history of moral theology, theological ethics. It's from Jesus to Francis. It's a big book. I've been working on it for 6 years, but I focus in from 1968 to 1980. There were all these people writing on suffering. So Dorothy Soul does her book on suffering. Skilovites does his book on Christ. Gutierrez does 3 works on suffering in liberation theology. Metz starts it in 1968 with the poverty of the spirit. And in all of these is an attentiveness to suffering. And it's very interesting, but in moral theology, we did not attend to suffering. We wrote about sin. what was sin and what was not sin. And we were trying to help priests who were in the confessional and trying to help penitents to understand what is sin and what isn't sin. And that they had, so our focus was always on sin. But from 68 to 80, there's this enormous shift in theology by these people that are trying to get us to see that, as Professor Stahlset said, that suffering is not from God, that God is not the cause of suffering, that heeding one's suffering and just accepting it is not necessarily very good theology. It may have to be part of one's own spirituality in terms of some suffering that cannot be changed. But there was a way that we hesitated to look at transforming our response to suffering, where we had a complacency about the suffering in the world. And as a matter of fact, from the 17th to the 20th century, moral theologians did not talk about suffering. Now that's all we talk about. If you look at African ethics, you look at Latin American ethics, you look at Asian ethics, you look at European ethics, it's an attentiveness to human suffering. The gaze has moved toward looking at and trying to respond to the suffering. Whence, for instance, this McGreevy calling me out saying, why haven't you written on street homelessness? But almost all of us are now writing on looking at suffering. And so we should be mindful that we come from a church that had us complacent about suffering, just as it has us sometimes complacent about the challenges of transgender people, has us complacent about how people should just stay in their place and be patient about gender inequity, you know, a variety of different things. So I do think it's important for us to realize that as educators, I think we're called to ask questions that we didn't have before, and to pay attention to the victim, to pay attention to where there seems to be what I keep calling a politics of overlooking. Who's being overlooked?
Thank you. Some of you who haven't had the chance to visit Regis College may not know, outside of our college is a large sculpture called the Homeless Jesus, and it's a Jesus lying on a park bench, which is a part of the attention to the mission of Regis College and the call for social justice. And many of our faculty are engaged in such social outreach. I know Professor Ryan and Coster were mentioned by Professor Keenan's comments. I wonder if they wanted to have some additional comments before we begin to wind down. I'll give them a moment to think about that. I did want to say that today's lecture is being recorded, and I believe it'll be available on the YouTube through the Fraser website, which you found the links from to get to this talk in the first place. So Professor Ryan or Coster, did you want to say brief concluding comments in response to what Professor Keenan said?
Yeah, I'm reminded of, and I think Sturla kind of positioned it this way too, difference between woundedness and vulnerability. I think there's almost a danger in which recognition can become an idealized project. I think beginning first with vulnerability allows us to collectively acknowledge our limitation, but our limitation not in terms of a kind of a restriction, but a limitation that allows a kind of an agency that acknowledges our interdependency, and our dependency upon each other then can, should, we hope, with fertile ground, enable us to either recognize or begin that labor of recognition. But what I appreciate about the introduction of conscience to the question of human flourishing, if you will, emancipation, is that yes, vulnerability is a nod to our interrelationality. Recognition is the quality of how we interact with each other. And conscience brings us back to that singularity of the human subject, but not in their existential isolation anymore, but a human subject now who is empowered positively to make deliberative decisions. And I think that's a fantastic, and it's a high ideal, But I think what Jim has done is he's concretized it and at least given us the wherewithal to begin the process of consideration of how do we move from these three various steps.
Professor Koster, any brief
I would
comments?
just want to add my great appreciation for Dr. Keenan for making connections between our talks and between our responses, and help us see in turn how our response connects with your paper, especially in my case about thinking about sin. That was very helpful to me. At another occasion, I would like to think a little bit further also about language of grace and the connection of grace between being bothered, being troubled, as an act of, as a sign of grace. And in justifying grace, I'm just interested in the interpretation of justifying grace as trust. How might that hold us to kind of make that kind of transition towards, kind of daring to be vulnerable. So these are not really kind of comments, but there are things that help me think further. So thank you.
That's great. Well, judging by your comments and your interaction, and those are public here, this certainly has been a very rich and rewarding discussion, and a very passionate. And I'm hoping that it will continue on beyond here and in the future events of the Fraser Center. I know we're nearing the end of our time here, and so it's my honor to now turn over the microphone to our dean, Professor Susan Wood, for some concluding comments.
I just want to say that we're absolutely delighted to host this event. Jim, it is wonderful to have you with us. I only wish you were all here in person. And I want to thank you for your wonderfully rich, provocative discussion. I think you've all launched us into a new way of thinking that for which I hope it has a rich future here. I want to thank our three respondents, Jared, Hilda, and Sturla, for your responses. You all showed that you could be plenary speakers in your own right, and this needed to be a week's event, not a 2-hour event on a Wednesday afternoon. Again, thank you very much. We're delighted to have you, and we hope that more of this thing can continue. One of the things we're starting to ask ourselves is, what have we learned from the pandemic, and how does this change how we move forward? And one of the gifts of the pandemic, if I can say that, is this opportunity for international collaboration for conferences in ways that we haven't done in the past. And hopefully that'll be a fruit for the future. So thank you very much.
Well, that'll conclude our panel today on the vulnerability recognition and conscience. Again, we thank all of our attendees and all our panelists for today, and we wish everyone all the best as we approach spring to keep safe and healthy. Prayers for you and your loved ones in your communities. So once again, many thanks, and we're signing off here from the Fraser Center at the Regis College. Thanks again.